Thanks. I think you've done the best introduction that you can for anyone. So thanks, and I'm sort of humbled. So let me quickly get into the presentation, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Satish. Go ahead.
So can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I think you've introduced the presentation, sorry, the topic. So I'll quickly get into, I'll use the next slide basically to set the stage as to what is happening. Right. So traditionally, if you look at it, the automotive industry, when we were growing up, and India has been that way, has caught up much faster in the last decade or so compared to when we were growing up. So basically, the automotive industry globally started off as companies which like Ford, GMs of the world, and they started with doing everything in-house. And they were at the forefront of all the corporate innovations and management techniques that we came to learn about. So that and it was at the forefront, and basically uh, the pioneers likewise. What happened over the years as technologies started to evolve and companies became large, they became multinationals. It was difficult for companies to do everything in house, and that was the time when uh, the uh, the overall industry uh, started to look at things like core competency, etc. And there was a little bit of desegregation, and some of these companies started sort of outsourcing and separating their internal uh, divisions and creating these monoliths called tier ones. And most of these companies in this phase, what we learned in our management speak, like, developed a network organization. It worked pretty well because all this was still just separation of work, and technically not much was changing in the automotive space other than efficiencies and what I would say is scale. However, subsequently what has happened is software started to make an appearance as part of the automotive world. And by that time, because most of the parts were being supplied by tier ones, the tier ones started picking up the slack and bringing in these technical innovations into the product. And that is where the power actually shifted to some extent to the tier ones rather than the OEMs. And depending on the OEM that you look at, in the past car, they still had better brands and more power. But as you go into the specialty vehicles, predominantly they ended up becoming aggregators. So they would bring in all the technologies from the various tier ones and put it together. And they would be the marketing and the branding, but very little technical work in terms of software would happen within the OEMs. What that has led to is the way I look at it, if I take a pass car, there are probably hundreds of suppliers contributing in their bits and pieces of software and an OEM having to integrate them. Now, as long as it was one or two displays and stuff, it was okay. But as things have been evolving, this is where it brings the whole industry to a junction where you have to make a choice per se. And just to give you the significance of what we are looking at, uh, if you think an iPhone is the most sophisticated product, you have 100 plus similar processors in a car today. There are probably 3 to 5 different networks working in the vehicle, managing different functionalities. And the ask or the implied needs from the consumers are real-time, fast responses. Top it up, safety is becoming more and more significant and asked from the consumers. In the Western world, it is already there, but I think in the global scenario, that is becoming more prevalent. And if you look at it from a commercial perspective, uh, software, or I would say electronics, drives bulk of the pricing that you pay for a vehicle today. So it's a massive shift from the mid 90s to where we are. And I think uh, what people are projecting, it would actually increase rather than decrease. And that's where I think this topic that we're talking about becomes pretty topical and interesting. So what it leads to is obviously the various companies and the various players. We talked about how the OEMs are sort of trying to be relevant, how the tier ones are trying to grab their share of, uh, I would say, pie. And obviously, there are new entrants who are coming in because the industry is evolving and they are trying to sort of uh, create a space for themselves. I have just put together a set of news clippings that would give you a look into how each of these companies are looking to transform themselves. This Toyota, Stellantis is a new brand. If you're not aware, Fiat Chrysler and PSA merged earlier this year, and this is the new brand. And what they say is they'll have an additional 23 billion in revenues from vehicle software sales by in the next 10 years. GM is partnering with Salesforce to create some consumer driven revenues. BMW is positioning itself as the force in mobility research. Volkswagen's new business strategy is driven around software and autonomous driving. Ford's partnership with Salesforce. Bosch, earlier this year, it was a very interesting setup. They've actually stepped aside. Their current businesses run, but what they have done is pooled all their software resources into one group. And what they're saying is they'll create a middleware or a universal vehicle for software. And they are seeing themselves as a software partner to the automotive industry rather than a pure play tier one. The company I work for, we are also embarking on a similar journey. And there's one such press release that we had earlier this year. So if I look at what is driving this change, right and center of it is technical evolution. The fact that pioneers like Apple have shown what can be done in a small device and it can be done in a robust way is changing the paradigm. What was thought was not possible, the OEMs and tier ones are being forced to look at it because uh, it's happening elsewhere in the other industries. And as we will see, that's also driving the threat from the new entrants. The next part is regulatory compliance and compliance needs. A lot of focus on climate, so that's forcing a lot of investments in electrification or new fuels. Focus on preventive and predictive maintenance, prognostics, because what people are saying is instead of changing an oil every 30,000 miles, why don't I change it when I really need to change it? And that is now possible because there is AI, there is data analytics available to help you make those choices. And it is in turn helping save resources and optimize them to the extent possible. Last but not the least, It's the consumer needs that is also driving. So we learned the latent or inherent needs in certain situations. I think people are seeing that if it is possible in a cell phone, and if there is convenience and there is a way to do it, why can't it be put in a car? And that's basically forcing a lot of rethink into how companies work. If I would put it in context, this is what we are seeing in this industry. The number of lines of code in a car is more than 100 million already. And with autonomous and electrification coming forth, it is supposed to triple. So that gives you a perspective of how the industry is going to unfold. The value of electronics and basically software and electronics in the vehicles in the next 10 years is supposed to be about 50 odd percent. It is already around 30% today. It used to be less than 5% 20 years back. And that's how the industry or the industry is evolving. So this brings us as to how, and we saw that diagram earlier in the presentation. If you look at it, even a simple car today has about 30 odd ECUs, and today the OEMs we just integrate. Going into the future and learning from some of these adjacent industries or other industries, a big shift that we are noticing and what we see today is the OEMs, tier ones, and the various partners and players working together and driving a change where there would probably, instead of 100 plus processors, maybe 5 to 10 odd domain controllers. And they would control bulk of the functionality of a vehicle. Now, this is significant because what it means is the tier ones, which were controlling their hardware and software, and they would give it to an OEM, and the OEM would control it or sort of integrate it. Now, there would be a new breed of players who would bring in all this functionality together, and then the hardware or the tier ones would lose some of their power in the whole setup. Similarly, the OEMs who would thrive on the ability to integrate complex programs may lose some ability, some advantage, because the complexity of integration, while it is huge, the separation of hardware and software makes it easier for an incumbent to make a play there. So this is the crux, in my opinion, of what the whole industry would shift into and would drive a lot of change. Given this situation, let's look at the various players. And this slide, I would put a disclaimer. I've just put in some representative names here. It's by no means complete and is by no means comprehensive, right? But I put this slide just to give you an idea of at least the key players who are, or the key players from key segments that are making a dash to grab a pie or grab a piece of this whole new game. So you have the traditional OEMs with thousands and thousands of people in their engineering workforce. Typically, a vehicle program takes anywhere between 2 to 5 years to launch. They are making or trying to make those changes in their operations. and they're trying to be nimble. A lot of them have set up completely new divisions to focus on this new technology or the new challenge. Some of them are trying to straddle both worlds. Let's see what happens. You also have the tool companies which are preparing and providing you a platform using which you could effect these changes. Not everyone has everything that works, but everyone is trying and everyone is trying to get into each other's territories. You also have the tech startups, which are bringing in capabilities and thoughts and learnings from other industries and coming up with specific learnings and algorithms to address particular use cases. So there are startups in connectivity, there are startups in new energy, there are tons of startups in autonomous, there are startups in services, you name it, and there are hundreds of players there, and these are all global. So obviously, as I said, I can have 5 slides each on each of these blocks, but I've just kept some representative names. It's by no means comprehensive. You see in some of these tech startups, even spin-offs of some of the traditional tier ones, which have shed all their past and sort of set themselves up new. A case in point is Aptiv. It used to be part of Delphi, which used to be part of GM. In its new avatar, it is as good as a startup. You also have the tech giants trying to grab a piece of the pie, trying to control the narrative in the industry, because they give you the backbone, they provide you those cloud services, they provide you the infrastructure, they provide a lot of tech, underlying tech that some of these companies are trying to leverage. And obviously, I'm sure they are going to have a play there. You have the semicon companies, and you would be pleasantly surprised how much invested each of these are. In the past, they would provide a silicon and the use cases to some extent, but not too interested, or they wouldn't invest a lot in trying to make it work for particular industries, because it was left to the OEMs and tier ones to figure out how to best use a processor. Today, NVIDIA itself, for example, if I look at it, they have invested millions of dollars trying to showcase the capability of their autonomous platform. Qualcomm is putting in millions of dollars trying to showcase and bring in those domain capabilities from an infotainment and connectivity perspective. So various semicon companies are looking at it and they're trying to grab a piece of the pie themselves. And then you also have the startups. And this actually muddles and makes the whole place interesting. Some of these startups are having the benefit of not having the cumbersome processes of the original giants and OEMs. However, not all of them have all the domain capabilities. Not all of them have all the learnings and the processes to launch a vehicle that is safe and which they can back for years to come. It is easy to put a demonstrator. It is easy to show running a few hundred miles, but to ensure that the vehicles run for years as consumers are used to, it is difficult. So not everyone is sort of thriving, but there are some unicorns. Tesla is the best example today, but is there another Tesla lurking there? Second, if you look at it, Tesla itself, their driving force was with electrification and not with autonomous. They still have, while they have those features, they still have to put in some effort to really back it up and launch it formally. Closer home, we have seen Ola, etc., launch our own vehicles in India. So it's an interesting play there. A take on this: if you see how things are changing and how things are evolving, what would who would be the winner? And that is where I think for us as management consultants uh, and people in the industry, we need to decide, or we need to look out for as to what whom to back, who would be the winner, and what are the underlying factors that will enable a winner. I'll pick up a snippet from a recent news. I think folks from India would correlate to that. This was a tweet sometime back from a pioneer in the industry who actually let go of the entire legacy business to launch motorcycles as the primary driver. However, at this stage, I would say there seems to be a bit of arrogance or a bit of complacency in the statement. Because yes, you are the number one today, but there are players and you never know. And that's what's happened with Tesla. They have stolen a march in the US on electrification. Or if you look at BYD in China, there are disruptors and not all will fail. And then there is the energy and the, I would say, the cockiness of the new players that they can win the world. The truth or the outcome would somewhere be in between. There will be failures from all quarters, and there will be winners from all quarters, is how I look at it. Given this, and I would come to, and this is, I have the last couple of slides, come to what would we need to do to be ready, and how do we see ourselves playing into this industry? I would say, and this is my personal view, and a lot of my colleagues in the industry agree, that the day that you could do everything yourself, or you could be the best at everything yourself, is over. It is an era of partnerships. I would say in some cases, as I said, in a limited space, Teslas and the Apples of the world, I would call them as exceptions because they have really managed to vertically integrate and keep a lot of the work in house. The other thing that I would like to highlight for the alumni and the audience, the way industry is changing, the days of generalists, I'm not saying it is over, but there is a lot more value to bring in a specialization in whatever you do. And what I'm observing, and in the industry that we are seeing, a lot more value to deeper knowledge and deeper technical background in addition to pure play software skills is what is emerging. The third for us, and this is where I would say if you're looking at a career and stuff, the understanding of definition of done is different from for different players. For a startup, and predominantly a tech startup, as long as they're able to show the ability to do something, they feel that they've done it. But the fact that you can't launch a vehicle unless you have tested the vehicle for millions of those test cases that you are supposed to, you will not confidently be able to launch a vehicle. So there is a huge journey that the industry has to make from what is technically possible to be able to launch a vehicle. And that is where I would say that for us, when we are choosing our careers and choosing the people we work for, we need to also take this into account, because a lot of things may look very exciting, but unless you're able to back it up with certainty, or to the extent possible, it's difficult to choose a winner. And the last that I would highlight, again, traditionally and predominantly from India, we look at it as we are the software powerhouse. A lot of things are happening globally. And case in point is Israel. If you look at it, no one had thought that Israel would have a thriving segment. Today, a lot of new technologies are coming out of Israel. Similarly, there are sudden sort of news items that you would come, like all across the world, non-traditional automotive hubs are throwing up startups, challengers, and technical innovations, which is sort of forcing the industry to leverage them and change. So for us, I think that's the, I would say, a learning and the leverage that we can work on. So that's my last slide. What I'll do is I'll take a minute. As KPIT, we're working, and there's a presentation, a slide on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish. Now it's open for questions. Please raise your hand, then we can take those questions, or you can put your questions in the chat box also.
Yeah, Rohan.
Hey, hi, that was a wonderful presentation. Thanks for that. Just a quick question to you. Considering my experience in a young startup in Bangalore, where we are trying to build a middleware for two-wheelers in EV segment, I was just thinking that whether the tradition, rather than the traditional OEMs who make the vehicles, do the phone companies, given their expertise in integrating different components with a chip, and making them work, stand a better chance to develop a software driven vehicle than the traditional automakers?
Uh, See, it depends on the tenacity and willingness to cover all use cases. So, and how deep the pockets are, because as you can see, it is one to put it in one mobile device, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're integrating, the scale is completely different. So
Okay.
obviously, companies like the Googles and Metas and the Microsofts of the world are in a different league. So
Mm-hmm.
they obviously stand a chance, but then I would say the OEMs are not too far behind,
Okay.
and in some cases they are partnering. So it
Uh-huh.
could also, as we talk about the industry partnerships evolving,
Mm-hmm.
surprises may be in store in the future, right? So you never know.
Okay. Okay. Just a follow up to this, how do you think that the service part of the industry, the auto servicing, would shape up now, considering that there would be no engines or oil change things? do we see that chips would have to be replaced from time to time, and how that would shape up? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that's a very good question, Ron. Uh, Whether it's a chip or an ECU that needs replacement, depending on the scale of functional upgrades that you're bringing in.
Mhm.
What we are observing is people are baking in a lot of redundancy already in the vehicle, looking at the future use cases,
Mhm.
and that is where uh, if you see this whole focus and shift to powerful microprocessors is happening.
Mhm.
So companies are looking, because that has been the traditional way. Now, can someone come up with a different approach? That's where the fun starts, right?
Yeah.
Because in trying to allocate processing power, you're also increasing cost,
Yeah.
right? So for future needs, it's that fine balance that someone has to. And I would say, uh, in specific geos, the play could become different,
Okay.
because you wouldn't want to bear that cost for a
Mhm.
frugal wake setup in a particular geography.
Okay. Yes,
Laksh,
Satish.
Lakshmi Narayan Gupta.
Yeah, hi Satish. Thanks for this presentation. I'm from banking industry and was particularly amazed by the slide on the number of code lines in a high-end car. So I have two questions. One is related to that. Uh, Nowadays, there is a lot of focus on security breaches in softwares and technologies. But while, as you mentioned, there are huge application of electronics and softwares in the high-end cars. We are not reading much, at least in the popular press, on security breach or hacking of high-end cars. So, would like to have your views and insights on this aspect. And my second question is related to as we are seeing the mobility industry is moving or is likely to move from traditional IC engines to EV segment in a big way over next 5 to 10 to 15 years. Would there be a big change in terms of the technologies which you currently provide, which we currently see in action or in use in the IC technology based automobile vis-a-vis the EV based automobile? Thanks.
Sure. So I'll address the first question on cybersecurity. Yes, it may not be in the news, but once in a while you always hear how a vehicle has been hacked, uh, and there are attacks. So obviously, so companies are working on it, and that is where some of these Israeli startups have picked up. There is a lot of work happening in academia. There were no standards for cybersecurity for automotive or the mobility industry. So those standards are evolving and they are becoming more and more stringent as people work towards it. So uh, I would say this is, people are aware, and that's where some of those tools and startups come in handy, and they are bringing in the best that is. But obviously, a lot of work needs to be done, and that exactly proves what I was trying to highlight. Right, autonomous tech company will be able to show that it can drive around, but how do you ensure that that is ironclad and safe and no one is able to hack? And that
Precisely,
brings
that's the
in
challenge.
layers of code and technical sort of uh, like provisioning, which goes beyond just uh, that functionality. And that is keeping the auto scientists really busy, I would say, today. Okay. And to your second point, yes, there. The first is, I would say, while there is a push with all these non-IC engines, I don't think the jury is completely out, and we have decided that okay, one technology will win versus the other. There's a lot of effort happening in trying to reduce the emissions from the IC engines itself. And depending on the use case, like pass cars, etc., you may be able to get it done for personal mobility. But when you're looking at commercials, there are other technologies that are starting to become or come into, like fuel cells, hydrogen, etc. Because with electrification, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is how is that electricity being generated? So while it is
Yes,
clean in the city, you're actually putting in so much carbon generating electricity.
correct.
So I think, and that's where a lot of these the governments are looking at it, and that's a separate top beyond just the ability to put a. See, electric vehicles have been around for hundreds of years, like more than 100 years back, and even in the 50s, and even in India, if you see, Reva was around since mid 90s.
Yes,
Right? So technology has been around, just that it starts to make sense because of these regulatory and the technical evolution.
thanks, Satish.
Thank you.
Rian, one more question is there. Can you please raise your question, Rian?
Sorry, that name is incorrect. I'm Vivek. Sorry for that.
Vivek, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So whatever is there, we have to read.
Yeah. I wasn't
Sorry.
aware about this name because my kid used to log in from this link.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry for that. Yeah. So that is a very insightful session. My one question is that there is a lot of disruption in the semiconductor supply chain. So, and a lot of OEMs are downsizing their additional features. So, how we are factoring in this factor, this disruption and future capacities are also very constrained. So, how we are factoring in this our future roadmap in terms of mobility and the things. Thanks.
So I think while so that disruption, in my opinion, is temporary. That is not changing the direction the industry is moving, right? So I think, and depending on how well the company is set up, the OEMs are and tier ones are responding accordingly. So I would not consider long term. I don't think it will have an impact. Longer term, actually, the impact it may have is the supply chains may become a lot more integrated and localized. So the learning from this has been that you need uh, some manufacturing and some of this capability closer home in the various geos. So, but from a technical perspective and technology evolution perspective, I don't think this shortage is going to have an impact. Maybe what it could do is give some player a temporary advantage, and that may play out in the long term, right? So it's more about leveraging it tactically to achieve your strategic goals. But from a technical evolution perspective, I don't think it will have a longer term impact.
Yeah. Thanks. Because a lot of work has also been done in engineering also to standardize the chips and to use those chips which are readily available. So all
Correct.
those works are also going on.
So that's operational, right? So, but
Yeah.
technically, it is not changing anything, right?
Yep.
The solutions are still being rolled out.
Yep. Thanks.
We'll take the last question from Karthik. So Karthik, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. Yeah, that was a really insightful session. My question is on the hardware part. Okay, so basically, I am from oil and gas industry. So one of the frequent problems that we face in digitization is hardware issues. That is like because of hardware issues, we have data continuity issues, and we have a lot of outliers. So just trying to correlate that with automotive industry. So how does automotive industry handle the hardware part, like on the IoT parts and sensor part, and what are the companies involved in this hardware part, and how does the automotive industry handle the outliers? Is my question. Thank you.
Yeah. So the difference you have, right? So for example, so that was Karthik, right? So Karthik, in the automotive industry, unlike in oil and gas, the investments or every year when you're launching a new vehicle, you have the opportunity to sort of upgrade uh, the technology, right? So I don't think companies go back and roll out newer functionalities in the older vehicles that they have sold. So while the problem is similar, the way they do it is different, right? So one way, obviously, technology exists for you, and in your industry, the way I look at it is the challenge would be the amount of money that you need to spend to just upgrade the hardware, because the older hardwares, and that's where I think there was a point, right? How much do you provision? If you provision for future upgrades, etc., when you implement that solution, it is going to be expensive. If you try to choose the hardware that just meets your existing use cases, it may be cheaper, but it makes you like you can't upgrade in future, right? So that balance and that choice stays with you, and the choice you make actually uh, hinders or helps you in the long run. And just before about 4 years back, I was actually driving smart manufacturing and IoT practice for KPIT at that time, and I know some of these constraints personally, because it's difficult to throw out all the existing hardware um, uh, in a particular industry. Uh, so there are add-ons, and I would say to some extent new investments would be required.
Okay, okay, that helps. And any particular companies which are working on this hardware part right now?
There are
Can
tons
you
of
share?
them. So I, so I'm not. I, we can connect offline, Karthik.
Yeah,
But
sure, sure, not
yeah,
a problem.
so
Yeah, yeah.
obviously there are tons of them, and obviously what works for, and there's a lot of factors before you make a choice, right? So I wouldn't recommend anything. I'm not an analyst that way.
Sure, sure, sure. Thank you.